True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with sand.
The Night Stalker. BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Almost 1/3 of Russian serial killers have committed cannibalism during their murder spree, but not as much is known about their crimes outside of the Federation. This book follows the stories of 13 cannibals from the Motherland. Alexander Spesivtsev, the Siberian Ripper, Dimitry and Natalia Baksheev, Nikolai, Fang, Dzhumagaliyev. All these killers were characterized by the same fetish, the erotic desire to consume the flesh of a person. Cursed by an uncontrollable hunger, they have committed some of the worst atrocities in the history of true crime. Illustrated with more than 250 photographs unearthed from the confidential files of the Kremlin's Ministry of Internal Affairs, Russian Cannibals, Addicted to Human Flesh, is a brutal encyclopedia of the men and women who have broken the ultimate taboo. The book that we're featuring this evening is Russian Cannibals, Addicted to Human Flesh, with my special guest, journalist and author, Nikolai Claux. Welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for this interview, Nikolai Claux.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on this latest of your books, Russian Cannibals.
Thank you.
Let's get right to the genesis of this book. You say right in the introduction that Russian serial killers are often associated with stories of cannibalism. When you started to do research on Russian serial killers for your first book, Russian Serial Killers, what did you quickly realize exactly?
I quickly realized that about 1/3 of 100 killers that I studied so far have at one point or another during their crime spree, they have tasted human flesh. And it became obvious to me that they needed a volume on their own. And when I started to write this volume, I quickly realized also that I needed several volumes because I really wanted to delve deep inside the stories because those stories were fascinating. It's extremely hard to find info on those cases. You have to read a lot of Russian newspapers and articles. Only basic info is available in the West. And there are cases that are practically not covered at all. There are cases that date back from the Soviet era before the 90s, but there are also cases that happened during the 90s and the early 2000s. Some of them were more or less covered in the West, but most of them were kept extremely local, even though they're extremely fascinating.
You talk about the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and then you talk about the starvation in the Ukraine later, and write about the meat markets that were photographs of the meat markets that were in the Soviet Union at that time. Tell us a little bit about, though, that most of the cases in this book, from what era are these featured serial killer cannibals? Where are they from? What era?
So it is true, yes, that there is a strong history in the 20th century of starvation and stories of cannibalism in Russia. For example, during the blockade of Leningrad during World War II, there were thousands of cases of cannibalism recorded during the year during which the blockade took place. This was because, of course, of the lack of food and starvation, and there was several episodes of hunger and famine after the Soviet Revolution. And of course, cannibalism was also practiced in the gulags by Russian prisoners.
Yes.
There is, for example, a famous anecdote told by this famous Russian writer, Solzhenitsyn, about the Gulag and the prisoners. When they tried to escape, they always kept a third prisoner or another prisoner with them, usually a political prisoner, and they called him a cow because they would actually eat that person on their way to freedom.
Wow.
So yes, cannibalism was a reality, harsh reality during the 20th century. But when it comes to serial killing and those kind of cases where cannibalism was committed by criminals and serial offenders, most of the time it was not committed because of hunger or practical reasons. It was just a sexual fetish that was developed by those killers. Like what happened with Jeffrey Dahmer in the United States or Dennis Nielsen in the UK. Those killers wanted to experience this fetish that they had developed for a very long time. And when I wrote about those serial killers in my first book, I realized that some of the killers that I studied had this fetish, which is called verophilia. It means the sexual attraction to the act of eating human flesh.
Right.
And the cases that I discuss in this book, most of the cases happen in the 1990s or the early 2000s. So it's not during World War II or even after.
Now, we're going to have you read the contents to the 13 cannibal killers that are featured. Just before we start, one major name is missing. You call the godfather of human flesh eaters, and that's Andrei Chikatilo. Why is he not included? Tell us why not.
When I started to compile all those names and all those stories, I quickly realized that Chikatilo could overshadow them. And the case is so complex and so many things have been written about him. So I wanted to focus on this first volume on killers that are practically unknown in the West. It made more sense to me. And I will talk about Chikatilo in the sequel to this book. And this book is more focused on other big names, like the Baksheevs, for example. It's this couple of cannibals who lived in the Krasnodar area, and they were actually arrested because workers found one of their mobile phones on the street, and they found pictures that they took of their victim.
Yes.
So this is a story that was covered in the West. I will go back to that story a little bit later because it's a very interesting story.
Yes.
But let me tell you the names of all those different killers that I cover. I first start with Moscow, the Moscow region, with Sergey Golovkin, also called Fisher by the Soviet press. At the time, he used to kill his victims at the same time than Chikatilo. And if I could compare his case to an American case, that would definitely be John Wayne Gacy. Right. He was targeting young teenagers. He had some kind of dungeon under his garage where he kept his victim. It's an extremely brutal case, very hard case to cover. And he definitely can be compared to Gacy in terms of ammo and different things surrounding the case. Then I cover several killers that operated in the St. Petersburg region. St. Petersburg is known in Russia for having lots of serial killers. It's like the Russian capital of serial killers.
Wow.
And for this book specifically, I have four different cases. I have Vasily Smirnov, also known as the Necromancer. Ilshat Kuzikov, also known as the Cook. I'll let you imagine what kind of meat he was cooking. Then there's Edward Shemyakov, the Resort Maniac. And Tamara Samsonova, the Granny Ripper, whose case was also a bit covered by the press, the Western press. So the next story, I mentioned it earlier, is the Baksheevs, the Krasnodar Cannibals. Then we go to the Volga region with Vladimir Nikolaev, the Ogre, and Alexander Bishkov, also known as the Predator. Then we go to Siberia with the Alexander Sibesevtsev, the Siberian Ripper, Kagashbek Orunbayev, the Ivoginsky Ripper. Then we go to Ukraine with the Kuzykovs, the father and son cannibals. And the last region we visit is Kazakhstan, a former Soviet province, which is now an independent republic. And Kazakhstan was the home of Nikolai Dzhumagaliyev, Metal Fang, and the Cannibal Cooks, an extremely bizarre case involving nurses who killed sex workers and ate them.
Let's get to Alexander Spesivtsev, the Siberian Ripper.
Yes.
Let's talk about this story.
So Spesivtsev is a very brutal case from Siberia. The number of his victims is unknown, but he was officially convicted of 19 murders in 1996. He lived in what people call in Russia commie block, a commie block. It's one of those very ugly, huge buildings with this typical Russian architecture. He lived on the top floor with his mother and sister, and he was in and out of psychiatric hospitals because he was like many other cannibals in Russia. He was declared insane for several other offenses. And in the 90s, he began to lure several victims, usually teenagers, to his apartment. And the crazy thing is that it's his own mother who actually helped him lure the victims back to his apartment.
Incredible.
That's the crazy part about this story. She did not actively help him kill the victims, but she did cook several meals using their flesh. And this is a fact that was certified by the police when they covered the case. It's an extremely brutal case. He would usually keep his victims alive for a few days, trapped inside the apartment. It's very reminiscent of this case in the US that inspired Silence of the Lambs. Gary Heineck. Yeah, except he didn't have a pit where he would keep his victims, but they were kept in his bedroom. He would chain them to his radiator and he would torture them for days. Rape was involved. And when one of them died, he would cut her up or made the other victims cut her up.
Yes.
And would cook her, feed the remains to his dog, and then feed the other victims with the meat and also eat the meals himself. So this case, yes, it's insanely brutal. He was arrested after 3 young patients from a local hospital disappeared. One of them was still found alive inside his apartment. The other 2 were found dismembered. One of the torsos was even found in his bathtub. And she didn't live long. She only lived like 3 or 4 days after being rescued. But she was able to give a chilling account, which is in the book, on her last days in this apartment of hell and all the torments that she suffered with her fellow friends at the end of Spesivtsev. It's an extremely grim case, one of the most brutal I covered in the book. One of the most insane aspects of the case was that this man was actually helped by his mother, who actually helped him lure the victims inside the apartment. She only spent about 10 years in prison and is a free woman now. Spesivtsev is locked up in an insane asylum somewhere in Russia. It's an interesting fact that in Russia, most of those cases, the killers are often declared mentally unfit for trial, and
Right.
they are sent to a psychiatric unit usually. They spend the rest of their life.
This book is filled with anecdotes which are shocking in the leniency and the treatment of these incredible killers that almost have no match anywhere in history.
Oh, yeah.
You talk about compulsory treatment for Spesivtsev before he was again sentenced to compulsory treatment once these crimes were revealed. Tell us about this compulsory treatment and sort of just the attitude of the Russians in terms of punishment in the courts for these killers.
Well, he actually had killed one of his girlfriends before committing this crime spree. And he spent only a few years in a hospital because he was declared schizophrenic by a psychiatrist. And after just a few years, they thought that he was fit for society and he was released under supervision. But it seems that the supervision was not strong enough because he actually killed just a few months after being released. And it's not the first time that the cannibal actually was released by from a psychiatric unit after committing a series of murders. And we can talk about the case of Nikolai Dzhumagaliyev from Kazakhstan, which is an extraordinary case because it seems so incredible for the Western mind. This is a man who we first killed because he thought that he was purifying society by killing loose women, Western women. So this man was a Kazakh. He was raised as a Muslim. And as a Muslim, he thought that other Russian women, especially Russian women from the north and the northwest of the country, were not pure and had very loose morals. So he decided to kill them, to teach them a lesson. And he had read in a book that by drinking their blood, he would gain some extra supernatural power. And that's what he did during his first murder. He drank the blood from his first victim and cut off some of body parts and cooked them and ate the meat. After that very first murder that happened in the late 70s, he developed what he described as some kind of addiction to human meat. That's also very interesting because you never really read about that when you read about cannibal cases. It's one of the only cases where the killer describes being addicted to the taste of human meat. And he also developed those strange beliefs about being invested by a supernatural power and by celebrating some kind of ritual sacrifice by killing those women. He killed 5 or 6 women in the 70s and early 80s and was arrested. He was sent to prison and he spent 7 years in close supervision before being transferred to another part of the country. During that transfer, he escaped and he went loose for several years when he killed again. And he was arrested, sent back to the psychiatric unit. And as incredible as it sounds, he was released.
Incredible.
Only 15 years in and out of psychiatric unit, even though it was proven that he had killed something like 7 or 8 women before. He just could not adjust to normal life. He tried to go back to his hometown. People, of course, tried to lynch him when he tried to come back to his hometown. So he had to escape. He lived in the mountains for a while. And then he was arrested again, the suspicion of another murder. And to this day, he still is locked up in a psychiatric unit in Kazakhstan. But what's interesting about this man, about Nikolai Dzhumagaliyev, is one of the few cannibals that was arrested that gave dozens and dozens of interviews to the press, not only the Russian press, but also the Western press. And during the 90s, you would often see true crime magazines with his confessions, with interviews. People would come from all over the world to Kazakhstan to interview him. And he would give interviews just asking for cigarettes or a few treats, and he would tell his life story. So you can even find TV interviews with him. It's really interesting case.
Now, getting back to some of the people featured, you had mentioned Dimitry and Natalia Baksheev, the Krasnodar Cannibals, a.k.a. the family of cannibals, in 2017. You include this story because you only have one kill, but the headlines are important in this story. You talk about and write about the difference in the coverage in Western newspapers and what you had to say about that.
So yes, in September 2017, there was a few headlines in the press around the world saying things like cannibal couple admit to eating up to 30 people in southwest Russia, or details about Russian cannibal couple who confessed to murdering and eating 30 people and posing for selfies with the body parts. So people were under the impression that there was this incredible case in Russia involving a couple of cannibals who had been killing for up to 30 years and taking selfies. So when I did some research on the case, I started with the info that was available in the West, but it didn't match up to what I was reading when I was reading Russian newspapers, and especially the local newspapers of Krasnodar who covered the case, and the trials, because there were several trials. So yes, the case started in 2017 because construction workers found a mobile phone on the street.
Yes.
And when they looked through the gallery, of the picture gallery, they found photos of an identified man with a human hand inside his mouth. And he was playing with body parts. So, of course, they brought the phone to the police. They quickly found the owner of the phone, and they raided the apartment of the owner. When they searched the apartment, they actually found photos of people that seemed to have been the victims of this couple. The apartment belonged to a married couple, the Baksheevs, Dimitry and Natalia Baksheev. So, of course, and they found, of course, remains, human remains. And some of the remains were stuffed inside glass jars. So, of course, the logical conclusion was that it was a case involving cannibalism. And since there were so many different pictures of body parts and people who seemed to be victims inside the apartment, rumors spread. And those photos were leaked in the media. So you could find them easily on the internet.
Yes.
So there are essentially photos of this man, Dimitry Baksheev, with this hand in his mouth and holding body parts and photos of the contents of the fridge. And that was in the first days of the case, before it even went to court. Under custody, they only confessed to one murder, and it was the murder of a woman they had met 1 week before. They had drunk with her, and Natalia Baksheev claimed that she tried to have intercourse, this woman, with her husband. And this is why she ordered her husband to kill her. And when he killed her, according to her, he was curious about eating her flesh. That's what she said. All this was debunked during the trial that took place a few months after. They never found any trace of any other victim except this one victim. And of course, there were pictures. Mm-hmm. The contents of jars were analyzed, and it was proven that they belonged to that victim. But other than that there was no proof that cannibalism was involved. And Dimitry Baksheev denied everything. He said that he never actually tried to eat the flesh. He just played with body parts because he thought it was funny, according to him. And he was a bit deranged, of course. But there was no proof. But still, the European and American media were telling that story of a cannibal couple that had killed up to 30 people. This was never actually proven. Dimitry Baksheev died in prison just 1 year after because he was very ill. He was treated for diabetes, and there was a problem in the facility where he was locked up. They couldn't give him his medication. So he died. Natalia Baksheev was sentenced to a few years of prison, but she was not sentenced for the murder. She was not actually convicted of the murder. So she got a lesser sentence. And the story of cannibalism was largely debunked by local press. But I still chose to include it in the book because I thought it was interesting to tell one story from the two perspectives and how legend is created from one single fact that's taken out of context by the press. And the legend of the Krasnodar cannibals is still very strong. If you go to true crime forums and you're talking about this case, people will tell you, oh yeah, they killed 30 people. This was debunked. This never happened. They only killed one person and the cannibalism wasn't even proved. But still, I found it very interesting to cover the case just to show the difference in perspective. But the other 12 cases that I cover are definitely cannibal cases, though those were proven.
You talk quite a bit about the prisons that these people are sentenced to, and you write them as strict regime colonies. And one of the ones that's featured with a couple of these guys, or two or three of these killers, is the notorious Black Dolphin prison. All of these people get this compulsory treatment in a hospital, but also this strict regime colony. As you do and you write in this book, can you comment about some of the prisons and the treatment and some anecdotes about those prisons?
There's 5 or 6 prisons like that in Russia. Most of them have the names of animals, like there is the black owl and of course the black dolphin. The black dolphin has been the subject of several documentaries, very interesting documentaries. It is the home of several serial killers, Russian serial killers. and Cannibals. And of course, some of the people that are included in the book ended up in that prison. Black Dolphin has a very bad reputation among Russian prisoners. It is the end of the road for many of them. It is the most brutal prison in the Russian system. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day in their cell. They do not have the right to sit on their bunk. So they stand up most of the time or they sit on a chair. They do not have access to anything. They cannot read. They cannot watch TV, of course. They work in workshops about 12 hours a day. And the only time that they have in a rec yard is 1 hour a day to stretch their legs, but it's just the space of 2 cells, so they can't really stretch their legs. It is often described as a living hell by prisoners, and there are very powerful photos that were taken there showing the prisoners bending face down when they leave their cell because they have to be disoriented when they move from one part of the prison to another.
Right.
So they are always followed by 3 or 4 guards. There are also huge dogs that are trained to bark at them if they flinch an eye. So yes, it's a very, very grim and bleak place where to end your life. It's also one of the few prisons where you never leave, actually, the prison, except if you confess to other crimes. And this is what happened with one of the cannibals that I mentioned in the book. He had to confess to other crimes so he could leave the prison and be transferred to another prison in another part of the country so he could show the locations where he had buried the victims after serving about 10 years in Black Dolphin. So he confessed to other crimes, knowing that he would be sentenced for that, just to have a break from that prison, basically.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop to hear from our sponsor. Are you a person that has experienced bloating so bad you've had to leave a social gathering? Many women experience this. Ritual literally created Symbiotic Plus with that problem in mind. It contains clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. My wife Lisa and I have been taking Ritual's multivitamins for many years now, and we were very interested when Ritual introduced their Symbiotic Plus, and so we both began taking it daily. We trust Ritual and their research, and we take Symbiotic Plus as well as our Ritual multivitamin every day. Why include a postbiotic? It provides fuel to the cells that make up the gut lining and supports a healthy gut barrier. Win-win. It has a delayed release capsule designed to help survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, an ideal place for probiotics to grow and thrive. Symbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide, your insides. There's no more shame in your gut game. That's why Ritual is offering my listeners 30% off during your first month. Visit ritual.com/murder to start Ritual or add Symbiotic Plus to your subscription today. Let's talk about another incredible cannibal killer, Alexander Bishkov, a.k.a. the Predator, or the Belinsky Cannibal, with 9 kills reigning from 2009 to 2012. Tell us about this. That it all started September 17, 2009.
Belinsky is a very young compared to the other killers included in the book. He started to kill in his early 20s. He kept a diary of his crimes where he would describe how he killed them, how he would cut parts from them. He was obsessed with the movie Predator, so he got his nickname from that movie. And the crimes happened in a very small town in rural Russia. He would target middle-aged men, usually alcoholics or transients, people who would not raise the attention of the police. And his first crime was actually someone he knew. It was someone who shared a room with his own mother. So he got away with his first crime. And When he found out that he was not even a suspect for that crime, he continued his crime spree. He never really gave a reason why he committed those crimes, except that he was fascinated by murder. He was obsessed with murder. He was obsessed with violent movies. When the police raided his home, they found lots of VHS tapes of horror and violent movies. And he saw himself as some kind of hunter that would hunt people in his hometown and kill them and eat them. What's interesting about this case, as I told you, this criminal was extremely young. He was about 25 when he was arrested.
Right.
And it was similar to Richard Ramirez in the US. He had lots of groupies when he was arrested. Lots of women started to write to him when he was in prison.
Wow.
And he actually married an American citizen, an American woman from Nevada, who actually moved to Russia to marry him. So this is extremely unique in the history of Russian serial killers.
It's interesting, you write that he commits these murders and this cannibalism, and there is somebody that takes the credit. It's not an unusual story, but in this story, it leads to an incredible twist. Somebody takes the credit for it, somebody mentally ill. How does this affect this case and the killings?
So the police was suspecting a local. It was a very large guy who had a history of mental problems, and he easily confessed to the murders. So he was sent to a psychiatric unit for this. Some people say that he was beaten during the custody, so the confessions were forced out of him, so to speak. But the thing is, when he was arrested, the killing spree continued. And in his diary, Bishkov actually said that he didn't like the fact that this man took the blame for the crimes because he did not, according to him, deserve the attention. And only him deserved the attention that those crimes he deserved. So he was extremely narcissistic. But yes, even after Bishkov was arrested, this individual remained in psychiatric hospital for quite a while, even though the real suspect was arrested.
What was Alexander Bishkov's culinary preference in terms of body parts, and what did he say in that regard in his memoir?
Bishkov was obsessed with the movie Hannibal with Anthony Hopkins. He was obsessed with the character of Hannibal, who, if you remember from the movie Hannibal Rising, is supposed to be of Russian origin. Well, he's not exactly Russian. He's from Lithuania, I think.
Lithuania.
Yeah, but for most people, the origins of Hannibal are that he is Russian. And Bishkov was proud of this heritage, I think. After the sixth murder, he cut out the heart of his victim and he put it in a bag and he brought it to an empty house. And he boiled it and he ate it. And he said that it tasted like pork. So after that, he tried different recipes on other victims. He boiled several body parts. He fried them in a frying pan with vegetable oil and salt and pepper, lemon and vodka. So you can see that he was influenced not only by horror movies, but he says that he was influenced by the study of practices of Mayan tribes. The Mayans sometimes would eat the heart of their victims when they harvested prisoners during their wars, and they would sacrifice them on top of the pyramids. Bishkov was fascinated by that fact, and by eating the heart of what he considered as his enemies, he would get their strength and get their life force inside him. So, yes, two major influences, Hannibal Lecter and the Mayas.
It's very interesting in this story, too, that someone he's speaking to confronts him and suspects him of being a killer. What does he do to this person when they say that to him?
Well, he killed him. He just couldn't take the risk of letting him live. The person was trying to blackmail him and said that if you don't give me money, I will tell everything to the authorities. And of course, Bishkov killed him and cut him up. So that's the one of the few victims that he knew, actually, because this man was one of his drinking companions. But he took the risk of killing him.
And he sat down for an interview once he was in prison. And you provide that interview in this book as well. Very, very interesting interview that was conducted.
Yes, he gave an interview to a Russian journalist. There are a few interviews in the book. As I said before, there is an interview with Dzhumagaliyev. There are interviews, but this interview is extremely interesting because he goes very deep inside the motivations and the details of each crime. He also talks about the contents of his diary and his obsession with horror movies and the movie Predator. He also mentions some of his influences. Surprisingly, he says that he wasn't very influenced by Chikatilo. He knew, of course, of Chikatilo, but he says that Chikatilo wasn't his idol because he was killing children. And Bishkov wanted people to understand that he was killing adults, middle-aged men who, according to him, did not deserve to live because they were alcoholics or transients. So yes, he wanted to make clear that he was not on the same level as Chikatilo regarding his choice of victims.
When we talk about Andrei Chikatilo, we get back to Sergey Golovkin.
Oh, yes.
And that you talked to that at the same time that he was killing, there was the Rostov maniac, which was the elusive Rostov maniac, was operating at the same time. So tell us about Sergey Golovkin and how authorities knew that it was not Chikatilo.
Golovkin was a killer who killed between 1986 and 1992. So it was more or less during the Chikatilo murder spree. The thing that separated them was, of course, the distance. Sergey Golovkin killed his victims in the suburbs of Moscow, specifically around a farm, a complex where they would breed horses. It was his job. He was a technician specialized in breeding horses, and he would kill his victims, his young victims, because they were young teenagers, around the farm in the suburbs of Moscow, whereas Chikatilo was killing his victims around Rostov, which is thousands of miles away. But still, wounds inflicted on some of the victims of Golovkin were similar to the wounds inflicted on some of Chikatilo's victims. And there were traces of cannibalism, dismemberment. Some of Golovkin's victims were flayed while they were still alive. So when the police found the bodies in the woods, because he buried some of his victims in the woods, they found some parts of their skin missing. So since they had absolutely no suspect and the only similar crime scenes that could be compared to those crime scenes were discovered in Rostov, they thought that the Rostov killer and Moscow killer were one and the same. But what's interesting is that they were more or less arrested at the same time, and both their names were known around Russia. We only know of the killer in the West, but Golovkin is equally as known in Russia. He's considered as one of Russia's main boogeyman because of the circumstances of the crimes and the extremely brutality of the murders. Also, those murders, they happen in a very posh area of Moscow where high-ranking officials lived. There was an ex-president of the Russian Federation who lived just a few streets away from where they found the bodies. So it made a huge impact on the Muscovites at the time. There's even a display in the local Museum of Crime in Moscow on Golovkin with pictures of his victims and some of the things that were recovered at his garage where he kept some of his victims.
You write that at first he attacked people and didn't have this garage, this thing built, this do-it-yourself torture chamber built yet. But when he had the opportunity, he bought a car and he started to build this garage with this hidden, again, torture chamber with rings on the walls. And so that is the similarity to John Wayne Gacy in that he had the privacy and he had the ability to do what he really wanted, which was to humiliate and torture and horrify these young men that he abducted.
What's also interesting is that he developed a modus operandi to lure them to the garage. And he would usually ask them if they were interested in robbing a storage unit or a house where there was vodka, other variables at the time. And when they agreed to go with him and to commit the crime with him, this is when he decided that they would die. Because for him, he needed this moral justification to kill them. So he would tell them to jump in the hood of his car so that they would be hidden and they would not be noticed by anyone. And instead of driving them to a place that they would rob, he would lead them to his garage, force them into the basement, and he would attach them to the ring, and when the torture began.
It's eerie how much he either learned from Gacy or how much he shared characteristically with Gacy, because Gacy based his murders also on that these guys were of low moral character.
Yep.
And very much like Sergey asserting that these guys, well, because they were weak and were going to commit the crimes, then they deserve to die.
Exactly. It's interesting to note the similarities in dynamics between well-known American serial killers and some lesser-known Russian serial killers. And sometimes you have equivalents of, say, for example, Richard Ramirez. There's an equivalent to Richard Ramirez, which I covered in my first book. It was called the Night Creature instead of the Night Stalker.
Mm-hmm.
And now in this book, that this criminal who is basically a Russian John Wayne Gacy. So it's interesting to see similar tactics used by those offenders to lure their victim to the crime scene. Of course, there's differences. For example, the mobility is important. The fact that in Russia, it was this time harder to have your own vehicle. So usually they would pick up victims that lived around their place, or they would just follow them in the woods and kill them in the woods. But for the specific offender, for Golovkin, his signature totally changed when he bought a car, because he could have a different way of luring them and luring them to a specific place where he killed them. He developed this garage for several years. He built it with his own hands. And it was in the middle of his crime spree. It was not even at the beginning of his crime spree. He was already a serial killer when he started to build this garage. So he knew more or less what he had in mind for them. He developed his fantasy and developed this idea of creating his own dungeon so he could develop and act out on those fantasies.
You have another killer featured, Vasily Smirnov.
Yes.
And which was called the Necromancer, 5 kills in 1979. What is an interesting characteristic of this killer and one of the reasons why he's included?
Smirnov is a very obscure case from the 70s. He killed 5, mostly children, also in the St. Petersburg region. When he was 18, he tried to kill his own mother with a hammer. So that tells you a lot about his psyche. He was sent to prison for rape. And while he was in prison, he was himself the victim of sexual assault. And he was kept as a sex slave by other inmates because they have this specific hierarchy in Russian prisons. Sexual offenders are often kept as sex slaves by other prisoners, thieves, inflict their own sexual depravity on those prisoners. And when he got out of prison, he was assaulted on his way to his home. He was assaulted by a group of teenagers. He survived the attack, but when he woke up, he swore to himself to take revenge on other people. And this is when the killing started.
He got a job to learn his craft, his eventual craft, at a slaughterhouse. And then soon after, he started attacking, didn't he?
Yes, that's interesting because he slaughtered cattle and he wanted to use his knife skills on his future victims. One of the characteristics of his crime is that he drove nails on his victims' heads, huge nails that he would drive with a hammer on his victims. There's not a specific reason why he did this, but this helped the police link the crimes together. In total, there were a total of 5 murders. Some of the victims had bite marks on their flesh. At first, they thought that it was animals who tried to feed on the corpses, but the bite marks were too smooth, and they eventually found out that they were human bite marks. So Smirnov had tried to bite off the flesh from his victims, but he couldn't. Teeth were not strong enough to rip off the flesh. It was just trying, but he actually drank from their blood. So he's still considered as a cannibal by the Russian police.
You say that finally a woman comes forward recognizing him as her rapist, and so he feels cornered. When the police come to his home, what happens?
What's incredible is that he actually set fire to his own home because he knew that they would find evidence inside his home connecting him to other rapes and possible murders. So he burned his own house and left. He was soon apprehended, but not before making a final victim. He raped a young girl in a park. He was nearly lynched by the locals, but the police got him in custody, and he soon confessed to 5 crimes, including a crime that was not even reported as a murder because he had left his victim on an open road and the victim was run over by a car. So the police thought that it was an accident. He was found to be sane and sent to a firing squad. But what's interesting about the case is that there were rumors in St. Petersburg about him not being executed, but being kept in a secret cell somewhere in Russia where scientists would study his brain. So, of course, it was just a rumor. He was executed, but that's an interesting anecdote concerning this particular murderer.
Yes. He had confessed to having tried to cannibalize one of his victims, but he also said that he ate some parts of the bodies of his other victims, didn't he?
Yes. What is really difficult in those kind of cases is to know if the person is telling the truth or not, because you cannot really find hard evidence of cannibalism unless you actually find the remains in plates or, So it's always difficult to see if the person is telling the truth or not. But given the personality of this kid, it's highly possible that he really did those things. And there's proof that he actually beat them. So it's extremely possible that they actually took parts of their flesh and ate them too.
Let's talk about one more incredible killer in case, the Ilshat Kuzikov, 3 kills. We mentioned him before, you mentioned him before, 1995, and called him the Cook. Very interesting background to have as an influence. Tell us what he witnessed when he was young.
Ilshat was from the St. Petersburg region as well. He witnessed murder of his own mother by his own father. So, of course, that influenced his psychological state when he was a young man. It happened when he was 11, and he beat her with his bare fist. So you can imagine the violence and the imprint on his mind as a young boy. He spent most of his life in and out of mental institutions. He said that he had a turtle as a pet, but he split it with a hammer when he was a boy. So that gives you an idea of his mental state.
Yes.
He spent some time in the Soviet army, but during his time in the army, he tried to kill one of his colleagues, and he beat him with a wrench, actually. And so he was sent to prison, but forensic psychiatrists diagnosed him with schizophrenia. So he was prescribed mandatory treatment in the psychiatric clinic. So he was released a few years after. And what's crazy is that he started to get a pension for that.
Yes.
According to Russian law, when you are diagnosed with a severe psychiatric condition. Even if you commit a crime, you get a pension from the state. He even got a studio, a small flat in central St. Petersburg,
Yes.
given by the state.
Wow.
As part of the program that they have for psychiatric patients. This is in this flat that he killed 3 persons. So each time it was the same story. He would befriend someone that he had met in a mental institution, and he would drink with him, befriend that person, invite him to his place. And when he would make advances on them, because he was gay, and that person refused the advances, this is when he would kill them. And he killed 3 persons like that. What's crazy is that, it happened in the course of several years. Each time he would get rid of the remains around his flat, so just a few blocks away from where he lived, in the open air. For example, he would leave their head in a box in the middle of the street. The police would find it just a few hours later. They would investigate some, but each time he would get away with it. The third time they decided to raid this place, and this is where they found human remains, and he confessed to the 3 crimes.
You're talking about a severed head, and you're talking about body parts in a glass jar from this guy, and also that he is the only person in this book. When we talked about the beginning about people's motivation for cannibalism in the 20s and the 30s in the Soviet Union and Ukraine for cannibalism was hunger. And this guy claims that because his generous pension with the government after the Soviet collapse was now not very good at all, that he actually didn't have the money for the basics and resorted to cannibalism because of hunger.
Yes, he even said that he never wanted to kill anyone, but that he was so hungry that this was his only way to get actual meat, because meat was so expensive in those times, especially in St. Petersburg. The city really suffered from the crisis, the economical crisis in the 90s. They didn't have the basic food supplies like sugar and bread. So he said that as a result, he had health problems, he suffered from malnutrition. And this is the reason he gave to the police when he explained the crimes. He said that he didn't really want to kill them, but that he was so hungry that pushed him to commit those crimes.
He was eventually sentenced, and again, what was he sentenced to? What did they deem him?
So he was released from criminal liability.
Yes.
And sent for compulsory treatment to the city psychiatric hospital with intensive supervision. So it's a special clinic, if you will, where they keep criminally insane, and all the murder charges were automatically dropped, because this is how the system works. Up until now, he's still alive. He's 57 years old now, and he's still somewhere in a psychiatric institution. But it's doubtful that he will ever be here again.
It's interesting that he was matched with a cellmate. What was the cellmate convicted of, interestingly?
So the cellmate he had the very first months where he was in prison was convicted of cannibalism too. He had cannibalized a drinking companion too.
Wow.
The other inmates were so afraid of him in the prison where he was kept in the beginning, that the only person who actually accepted to share a cell with him was another cannibal. So that tells you a lot about the fear that he spread around, even in prison.
You say he's still alive, but what did the press report in the early 2000s?
In the early 2000s, the press reported that he had died within the walls of the hospital. But this was debunked in 2017. The administration of the hospital confirmed that he was still alive, and he continued to undergo the course of treatment prescribed to him within the walls of the institution.
You have put this book together, and there will be another collection. What was just the most profound characteristic that all of these, other than cannibalism, that all of these killers contained?
One of the common traits among all those cannibals is the addiction to human flesh. Most of them were willing to share recipes on how they cooked it. They described how addictive it was for them and the pleasure they derived from actually doing it. It's an interesting trait. It's also interesting how the media is sharing those stories and perpetrates the might of the Russian cannibal, which, well, objectively is not a might, since, as I told you before, 1/3 of the serial killers that I studied when I was researching my first book have committed cannibalism in one form or another.
And all of these people seem to provide some rationalization for the murder, but very much there seemed to be no real rationalization, obviously, but many of them talking about superseding the morals of humanity with this becoming supermen based on these transgressions.
There is this belief in most of them that what they did made them stronger, physically stronger. And some of them said that they were justified in doing what they did because they were cleansing society from its bad elements.
Yes.
This is something that you find, for example, in the last case that I cover in the book. It's a very obscure case from Kazakhstan involving 3 male nurses from a psychiatric hospital.
Yes.
Who were killing sex workers in the capital of Kazakhstan. And their moral justification was that they're seeing themselves as street cleaners. That's how they call themselves. So there is this moral justification that you find in some of those individuals.
Yes, absolutely. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book, Russian Cannibals Addicted to Human Flesh. For people that want to take a look, tell us about your website, but also what is new on the horizon for you, Nico Claux.
You can find the book on my website, www.serialpleasures.com or Amazon. There are 2 versions of the book. There is a hardback version and softcover. This is the second book in a series of 5 books that I will be doing on the subject of Russian serial killers. I try to take some time in between each book because it demands a lot of research.
Yes.
And a lot of energy too. But I'm really proud of those books. I try to focus on stories that are not really well known in the West and deserve some attention because those stories tell a lot about the minds of serial killers and the minds of repeat offenders from a different perspective. What's interesting is to also explore the culture, the differences in culture, and how culture might sometimes influence those killers, even though there are similarities between Western and Eastern serial killers. But each nationality, and for Russia, which is a gigantic country, each region has its own specialties. Siberian serial killers are different from the ones that operate around St. Petersburg or Moscow, for example. So it's really fascinating to see all those differences. Speaking of Russian serial killers, I am also the curator of an expo that is starting a world tour. So we are starting with Europe, starting in Rome in next month, in October. It's the first expo of this kind. It's a tour. We'll be touring several major European capitals during the next years, and we will go to the US in a couple of years. So it will be the first expo of this kind. Of course, we cover American serial killers, but I want this expo to also show other cases around the world. So there will be a section on Russian serial killers and cannibals. Right now, I'm trying to negotiate objects that belong to Chikatilo, which will be a first. It's the first time that we'll be able to see, for example, the hat that he was wearing when he was arrested, or the glasses that he was arrested. For this expo in Rome, we have purchased the glasses of Jeffrey Dahmer. So be touring the world with Jeffrey Dahmer glasses, one of the pairs that he was wearing. I know that one of the pairs is in Alcatraz East Museum in the US, but these other pairs that we acquired from what is called the Jeffrey Dahmer collection will be in our expo, as well as many, many, many other interesting objects like the freezer that belong to German cannibal Armin Maives and other fascinating objects too. So it's a major expo, the first of its kind. I'm really proud to be part of this adventure. It will last several years. So just watch this space and my social medias if you want to learn more about the expo. I am on Instagram, Nico Claux _official, and on Facebook, I'm the Nico Claux.
Thank you so much, Nico Claux, for Russian Cannibals Addicted to Human Flesh. And what I hadn't mentioned was the incredible collection of 250 photos in this book. Extraordinary, just to add to the enormity and the magnitude of this first in the series, this collection of cannibal killers. Well, thank you so much, Nico Claux, for Russian Cannibals Addicted to Human Flesh. You have a great evening, and thank you so much for this interview, and good night.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.